The 48-hour ultimatum that the President of the United States published on Truth Social at 11:44 p.m. Washington time on Saturday night is not a negotiating position designed to create diplomatic space for a resolution. It is a countdown to an attack on civilian infrastructure that will plunge millions of Iranians into darkness, while producing none of the strategic outcomes the administration has claimed this war was designed to achieve. Within 48 hours from the moment Trump posted, Iran must fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz, or the United States will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. That deadline expires at 11:44 p.m. Washington time on Monday night. The timing of the ultimatum, issued less than 24 hours after Trump posted that the United States is getting very close to meeting our objectives as we consider winding down our great military efforts in the Middle East, describes a decision-making structure that has moved beyond strategic incoherence into something approaching operational chaos. The president, who claimed Friday that America is weeks ahead of schedule and considering winding down the conflict, has now set a countdown timer for strikes against Iranian power infrastructure that will affect every hospital, water treatment facility, and civilian household in the country. If you're finding value in this analysis, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. What happened in the 12 hours between the winding down post and the power plant ultimatum was not a sudden deterioration in the military situation that required immediate escalation. What happened was that Iranian ballistic missiles struck the southern Israeli cities of Dimona and Arad, penetrating Israel's multi-layered air defense system and injuring at least 84 people in what Israeli officials declared a mass casualty event. The missile that hit Dimona struck approximately 13 kilometers from Israel's secretive nuclear research facility. The missiles that hit Arad destroyed multiple buildings, blew out bus windows, and required emergency services to search rubble for people still unaccounted for hours after impact. The Israeli military stated publicly that its air defenses failed to intercept the missiles before they struck populated areas. That statement, examined alongside the casualty figures and the damage images circulating from both cities, contradicts 3 weeks of official characterizations that have described Israeli and American defensive systems as maintaining near-total dominance over Iranian offensive capabilities. The gap between what the interception rate statistics claim and what happens when missiles reach the ground has now accumulated enough documented evidence that the statistics themselves require analytical scrutiny rather than acceptance at face value. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed it targeted military installations and security facilities in Arad, Dimona, Eilat, Beersheba, and Kiryat Gat in its most recent missile salvo. Tehran claimed more than 200 people were killed in the attacks. Israel reported no deaths, but the images of destroyed buildings and the mass casualty declaration in Arad describe an impact that extends considerably beyond the incidental damage from intercepted fragments that official communications have been characterizing as the typical outcome of Iranian strikes. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated after the attacks that Israel had experienced a very difficult evening in the battle for our future. That language is significant not for what it says, but for what it does not say. It does not claim victory. It does not declare that defenses functioned as designed. It acknowledges difficulty. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf stated before word of the Arad strike spread that if the Israeli regime is unable to intercept missiles in the heavily protected Dimona area, it is, operationally, a sign of entering a new phase of the battle. The Dimona area is among the most heavily defended locations in Israel, precisely because of the nuclear facility located there. If missiles are reaching that area despite the concentrated defensive architecture, the operational implication is that other areas with less concentrated defenses are considerably more vulnerable. The IRGC framed the Dimona and Arad strikes as retaliation for an earlier American-Israeli strike on Iran's Natanz nuclear enrichment facility. The Natanz complex was struck for the second time on Saturday morning. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization confirmed the attack and stated that there was no leakage of radioactive materials reported at the Shahid Ahmadi Roshan enrichment facility. The UN's nuclear watchdog issued a statement calling for military restraint to avoid any risk of a nuclear accident. That warning, issued by the International Atomic Energy Agency in response to strikes on nuclear facilities by both sides within the same 24-hour period, describes a conflict that has now reached the threshold where the risk of radiological contamination from conventional military operations has become significant enough to warrant international alarm. Russia's Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, condemned the strike on Natanz as a blatant violation of international law. The Russian condemnation of strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, while Russia is simultaneously providing Iran with real-time satellite targeting coordinates for American military assets, describes a strategic positioning that deserves careful examination. Russia is not simply supporting Iran diplomatically while remaining neutral operationally. Moscow is providing Tehran with exquisite intelligence that enables precision strikes against American forces while condemning American strikes against Iranian facilities under international law frameworks. That dual positioning allows Russia to maintain diplomatic credibility with international institutions while operationally degrading American military capacity in a theater where the two nuclear powers are not directly engaged, but are conducting what amounts to a proxy confrontation through intelligence provision and targeting support. Trump's 48-hour ultimatum specifies that the United States will strike Iranian power plants, beginning with the biggest one first. The president did not specify which facility he considers the biggest. Iran operates approximately 400 power plants, according to open-source infrastructure databases. The largest by electrical output is the Damavand Combined Cycle Power Plant, located approximately 70 kilometers southeast of downtown Tehran, with an output capacity of 2,868 megawatts. The second largest is the Shahid Salimi facility in Mazandaran province near the Caspian Sea, with an output of 2,215 megawatts. The Karun 3 hydroelectric dam produces marginally more electricity than Shahid Salimi under optimal conditions. Iran also operates one nuclear power plant, the Bushehr facility on the southern coast, 750 miles south of Tehran. The ambiguity in Trump's statement about which plant constitutes the biggest creates operational uncertainty about whether the threat references electrical output capacity, physical size, strategic importance, or symbolic value. That ambiguity may be deliberate, designed to force Iranian decision-makers to consider multiple possible targets simultaneously, or it may reflect the same lack of strategic precision that has characterized much of the public communication about this conflict's objectives and execution. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya military command headquarters responded to Trump's ultimatum by stating that if the United States attacks Iran's fuel and energy infrastructure, Iran will target all U.S. energy, information technology, and desalination infrastructure in the region. That response establishes a symmetrical escalation framework. Strikes against Iranian power plants that affect civilian populations will be met with strikes against American and allied infrastructure that supports civilian life across the Gulf. The desalination facilities that provide fresh water to Gulf populations, the IT infrastructure that enables modern economies to function, the energy installations that have already been targeted but would face intensified attacks under this framework. All of these become declared targets if Trump executes the power plant threat. The timing of the ultimatum, the substance of the threat, and the strategic logic underpinning it all point toward a fundamental problem that has now become impossible to ignore. The administration launched a war against Iran with stated objectives that included preventing Iran from ever acquiring nuclear weapons, degrading its offensive military capacity, and eliminating its leadership structure. 3 weeks into that campaign, Iran's nuclear facilities continue to enrich uranium despite repeated strikes. Its offensive capacity continues to execute 70 waves of attacks against Israel and American bases. Its leadership structure, despite the assassination of the supreme leader and multiple senior officials, continues to coordinate strategic-level operations, including precision strikes on Israeli cities and successful targeting of American bases across multiple theaters. The objectives have not been achieved. The timeline that was supposed to measure days has extended to weeks, with projections now reaching into months and potentially years, according to Goldman Sachs energy analysts. And the exit strategy that was supposed to provide a clean conclusion before economic consequences became politically unbearable has instead produced an energy crisis that forced the administration to lift sanctions on Iranian oil while simultaneously bombing Iranian infrastructure. The power plant ultimatum is not a tool for achieving the war's stated objectives. Destroying Iranian electrical infrastructure will not prevent uranium enrichment at underground facilities designed to operate independently. It will not degrade Iran's missile production capacity, which relies on distributed manufacturing networks and foreign component supply rather than grid electricity. It will not eliminate command structures that have demonstrated resilience to decapitation strikes. What destroying power plants will do is plunge Iranian cities into darkness, shut down hospitals, halt water treatment systems, disable traffic control infrastructure, and produce a humanitarian catastrophe that will kill more Iranian civilians in the weeks following the strikes than 3 weeks of precision bombing has killed to date. That outcome will generate international condemnation, fracture whatever remains of coalition support, provide Iran with a massive propaganda victory, and create conditions that make any negotiated resolution to this conflict considerably more difficult to achieve. The Strait of Hormuz, the waterway whose closure triggered the ultimatum, remains effectively closed to Western shipping, despite Trump's demand. Iran's representative to the UN International Maritime Organization stated Sunday that the strait remains open to all vessels except those belonging to Iran's enemies, and that the safety of ships and their crews requires coordination with Iranian authorities. That formulation, examined carefully, describes a position Iran has held since the conflict began. The waterway is not physically blocked, but commercial shipping companies have determined that the risk of Iranian attack makes transit uninsurable and operationally infeasible. 22 countries have now signed a joint statement expressing readiness to contribute to appropriate efforts to ensure safe passage through the strait. The United Arab Emirates and Australia are the latest additions to that list. The statement is carefully worded. It signals readiness to contribute, not actual contribution. It references appropriate efforts, not American-led military escort operations. The gap between rhetorical support and operational commitment remains substantial, and the 48-hour ultimatum has done nothing to close it. The European Commission has urged EU member states to lower gas storage targets in response to the energy crisis, signaling that Brussels expects elevated prices and supply disruption to persist considerably longer than the brief operation framing suggested. EU Energy Commissioner Dan Jurgensen reminded energy ministers of flexibilities available under current gas storage regulations, including the ability to reduce storage targets by up to 20 percentage points under difficult market conditions. That guidance, issued 4 weeks into a conflict that was supposed to restore stability to energy markets, describes a European recognition that the disruption is structural rather than temporary, and that governments need to adjust their planning assumptions accordingly. Brent crude settled above $112 per barrel on Friday. West Texas Intermediate exceeded $98. Those prices reflect a market that has priced in the closure of Hormuz as a medium-term condition rather than a temporary disruption awaiting resolution. The International Energy Agency described the situation as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That characterization, coming from the organization responsible for coordinating international energy policy, is not the language of a crisis approaching resolution. It is the language of a structural break in the global energy system. The regional picture surrounding the conflict continues to deteriorate across every dimension simultaneously. Bahrain's defense forces reported intercepting and destroying 143 missiles and 242 drones since the conflict began. Jordan's military reported that 240 missiles and drones have been fired at Jordan, wounding 24 people. The United Arab Emirates reported responding to 3 ballistic missiles and 8 drone attacks on Saturday alone. Saudi Arabia shot down 47 drones on Saturday, including a concentrated barrage of 38 drones within 3 hours. Every Gulf state that hosts American military infrastructure or provides basing access for U.S. operations is absorbing direct Iranian strikes on its territory and infrastructure, despite the security guarantees that were supposed to prevent exactly this outcome. Qatar's CEO of Qatar Energy stated that the Iranian strike on the Ras Laffan LNG facility has cut approximately 17% of output for as long as 5 years. With Qatar supplying 20% of global LNG, that disruption forces the imposition of force majeure on contracts with Belgium, Italy, South Korea, and China. The energy markets already destabilized by Hormuz closure are now facing the long-term loss of one of the world's largest LNG production facilities. The cumulative effect of these disruptions is not additive, it is multiplicative. Each closure, each strike, each facility taken offline compounds the effects of the others, creating cascading impacts across supply chains, manufacturing networks, and economic sectors that extend far beyond the immediate theater of conflict. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced Saturday that Tehran is ready to facilitate the passage of Japanese vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, and that negotiations with Japan on the issue are ongoing. That offer, extended to a specific country while the waterway remains effectively closed to Western shipping, is part of the diplomatic architecture Iran is building to fracture the American coalition. Japan depends on Gulf energy imports. If Iran can offer preferential passage in exchange for Japanese neutrality or passive non-support for American operations, the strategic calculation changes for every country whose economy depends on stable energy supply. The same offer could be extended to South Korea, India, China, or any other major energy consumer whose government concludes that maintaining access to Gulf energy is more important than supporting American military operations. The human cost of the conflict continues to accumulate in ways that official casualty figures do not fully capture. Iran's foreign minister stated Monday that hundreds of Iranian civilians, including more than 200 children, have been killed since the conflict began. The U.S.-based rights group Irhana reported that at least 1,406 civilians, including 210 children, and 1,167 military personnel have been killed. Another 657 people have been killed, but it has not yet been determined whether they were civilian or military. In Lebanon, Israeli strikes have killed at least 1,024 people since Hezbollah entered the conflict on March 2nd, including 118 children. In Iraq, at least 61 members of the Popular Mobilization Forces have been killed. A French soldier was killed in Iraqi Kurdistan. American casualties remain officially reported as 6 killed in Kuwait, though the patterns around aircraft losses and base attacks suggest the actual figure may be higher. The contradiction between the power plant ultimatum and every stated objective of this war is not a communications problem requiring better messaging. It is a strategic problem requiring acknowledgement that the campaign is not producing the outcomes its architects predicted, and that escalation is being driven by the absence of achievable objectives rather than by progress toward them. Destroying Iranian electrical infrastructure will not open the Strait of Hormuz. It will not eliminate Iran's missile capabilities. It will not restore coalition cohesion. It will not reduce oil prices. It will not create the conditions for a negotiated settlement. What it will do is kill Iranian civilians, generate international condemnation, provide Iran with justification for strikes against Gulf infrastructure that Western economies depend on, and make the eventual resolution of this conflict more difficult to achieve on terms that the United States can accept. The deadline expires at 11:44 p.m. Washington time on Monday night. When it does, the decision of whether to execute the threat will reveal whether the administration retains any capacity for strategic restraint or whether the trajectory of this conflict has passed the point where decision-makers can still choose de-escalation over the momentum of their own rhetoric. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. When the 48-hour deadline expires and the decision whether to strike Iranian power plants reaches the point where it can no longer be deferred, the analysis will be here. When Iran's response to that decision takes operational form, the analysis will be here. When the energy crisis reaches the point where European governments can no longer absorb the economic consequences without acting, the analysis will be here. This channel documents the gap between what officials say and what the evidence shows, connects the military and economic and diplomatic dimensions that official communications keep artificially separate, and tells you what the assembled picture actually reveals rather than what the briefing is designed to communicate. Leave one question in the comments. Can an ultimatum that threatens civilian infrastructure produce the strategic outcome it claims to seek? Or does the power plant threat describe an administration that has run out of military options that advance its objectives and is now escalating because it cannot find an exit. Every response gets read.